Matteo Russo had not entered a children's hospital since the night his wife died, but 7 years later, he returned to sign the papers that would place her name above an entire medical wing. The Elena Russo Pediatric Center was supposed to be a final tribute, a polished monument built from marble, money, and guilt. Hospital executives waited in the conference room with prepared speeches. Photographers stood beneath the new bronze sign, and Matteo's security team had already cleared every corridor between the private entrance and the boardroom. Nothing was supposed to delay him. Then he heard the song. It drifted through a half-open door at the end of the hallway, so soft that at first Matteo thought grief had finally begun playing tricks on him. He stopped walking, and the men behind him nearly collided with one another before noticing the expression on his face. The melody was slow and uneven, built around 4 quiet notes that rose and fell like a mother's hand brushing across a child's hair. Elena had written it during the first winter of their marriage, when she still believed Matteo could leave the Russo family and build an ordinary life with her somewhere far from Boston. She had never recorded it. She had never sung it in public. As far as Matteo knew, only 2 people had ever heard that lullaby. One of them was dead. The other was standing in the corridor. "Boss?" his security chief asked carefully. "The board is waiting." Matteo lifted one hand, silencing him. The song continued from inside the hospital room. He moved toward the door, without realizing he had started walking. The closer he came, the clearer the woman's voice became, carrying the same pauses Elena used whenever emotion tightened her throat. Matteo felt something cold move beneath his ribs. He pushed the door open. A young boy lay asleep beneath white blankets, thin and pale beneath the glow of the medical monitors. Clear tubing ran beneath his nose, and one small hand rested against a faded photograph on his chest. Beside the bed sat a woman in navy scrubs. Her dark hair was tied into a loose knot, and exhaustion had settled deeply beneath her eyes. She was facing away from the door, gently rubbing the boy's arm while she sang. Matteo could not see her face. He did not need to. His body recognized her before his mind allowed the possibility. The slight tilt of her head, the scar near her left wrist, the way she pressed her lips together between verses, as if holding back tears. Elena. The song stopped. The woman's hand froze on the child's blanket. For several seconds, she remained completely still, and Matteo could hear only the soft rhythm of the monitors and the distant movement of nurses beyond the room. Then she turned. 7 years of grief collapsed inside him at once. She was thinner than the woman he remembered, her face marked by fatigue and fear, but there was no mistaking the eyes that had once made Boston's most feared Mafia boss believe he could still become a decent man. Elena Russo was alive. Her gaze moved past Matteo to the armed men standing in the hallway, and panic immediately replaced shock. "You cannot be here," she whispered. Matteo entered the room slowly. "I buried you." Elena stood and moved between him and the hospital bed. "I know. You let me believe you were dead. I was trying to keep him alive." Matteo looked toward the sleeping child. Only then did he notice the photograph beneath the boy's hand. It was an old picture of Matteo and Elena on their wedding day, folded and worn along the edges as though someone had opened it hundreds of times. The boy stirred. His eyes opened slowly, revealing the same dark gray color Matteo saw every morning in the mirror. He looked at Elena first, then at the man standing near the foot of his bed. His small face changed with recognition. "Mom," he whispered weakly. "Is that Dad?" Elena closed her eyes. Matteo stopped breathing, and the monitors beside the bed suddenly began sounding an alarm. The alarm shattered the room before Matteo could answer. A nurse rushed in, followed by 2 doctors who moved immediately toward the bed. Elena turned away from Matteo and reached for the boy, but one of the doctors gently guided her back. "His oxygen is dropping. We need space." The child's breathing became shallow and uneven as the monitor continued to sound. Elena stood beside the wall, with both hands pressed over her mouth, trying not to fall apart while the medical team adjusted the tubing and checked the lines connected to his chest. Matteo remained near the foot of the bed, unable to move. He had faced gunfire, betrayal, and men who had sworn to destroy everything he owned. None of it had prepared him for the sight of a small boy struggling to breathe while staring at him with his own eyes. The boy had called him Dad. Not sir, not stranger. Dad. After several tense minutes, the monitor began to steady. The doctor adjusted the blanket and looked toward Elena. He is stable, but he needs rest. No stress, no raised voices, and no more visitors until we complete the next round of tests. Matteo's jaw tightened at the word visitors, but he said nothing. Elena nodded quickly. I understand. The doctor glanced at Matteo and the men waiting outside the door. He clearly recognized the name attached to the new hospital wing, but professional caution kept his expression neutral. Immediate family, only. Elena looked at Matteo before answering. He is not staying. The words were quiet, but they carried enough force to change the temperature in the room. Matteo waited until the doctors and nurses stepped into the hallway. Then he closed the door behind them, leaving one of his guards outside. Elena moved back to the bedside and took the boy's hand. You need to leave, she said without looking at him. Matteo's voice came out lower than before. He knows who I am. He knows a photograph. He called me his father. Her fingers tightened around the child's hand, because I never lied to him about that. Matteo stared at her. You told him about me, but you never told me about him? Elena finally turned. The pain in her face was older than the fear. I told him that his father once loved us. I told him you were powerful, complicated, and trapped inside a family that destroyed everything it touched. I did not tell him you would come for us, because I had no right to give him hope I could not guarantee. Matteo took one measured step closer. How old is he? Cease. The answer landed with brutal precision. Elena had disappeared 7 years ago. She had been pregnant when he believed she died. Matteo looked toward the boy again. Dark hair, grey eyes, the same narrow crease between the brows that every Russo man carried when concentrating. The resemblance was no longer a possibility. It was a confession written across the child's face. What is his name? Luca. Matteo closed his eyes briefly. His grandfather's name. Elena noticed the reaction and looked away. What is wrong with him? The question changed her expression. He has a congenital heart condition. It was manageable when he was younger, but it has progressed. He needs surgery. Matteo's attention shifted toward the medical chart beside the bed. Why is he still waiting? Because the procedure is complicated. I can bring in anyone. I know. Then, why did you not contact me? Elena stood so quickly that the chair scraped across the floor. Because the last time I trusted your family, someone tried to kill me before our son was born. Matteo went completely still. Elena's voice trembled, but she kept it controlled for Luca's sake. The car explosion was not an accident. Your uncle arranged it after he learned I was pregnant. He told me a child would give you something more important than the Russo organization, and that made both of us dangerous. My uncle is dead. He was alive when I ran, and the men who worked for him are still part of your empire. Matteo's expression darkened. Who helped you disappear? A doctor who treated me after the explosion. He changed the records and helped me leave Boston. I spent 6 years moving from one hospital to another whenever someone asked too many questions. Matteo looked at the woman he had mourned, then at the child whose entire life had unfolded without him. You should have come to me. Elena's eyes filled, but her voice remained steady. I tried. She reached beneath Luca's pillow and pulled out an old envelope, its edges softened from being handled many times. I sent this to you 6 years ago. Matteo took it. His name was written across the front in Elena's handwriting. The envelope had never been opened. Across the corner was a black stamp used only by the private security office at the Russo estate. Intercepted. Do not deliver. Matteo stared at the mark. Then the door opened behind him. His security chief entered, pale and tense. Boss, We traced the authorization code on that envelope. Matteo looked up. The man hesitated before speaking. It belongs to someone who still works for you. Matteo looked at the unopened envelope again, then at the black security stamp pressed across the corner. For 6 years, Elena had believed he received her message and chose not to answer. For 6 years, Luca had grown up hearing about a father who knew he existed but never came. The truth was worse. Someone inside Matteo's own organization had made that decision for him. He turned toward his security chief. Who authorized it? The man glanced at Elena and Luca before answering. Salvatore Russo. The name settled over the room like poison. Salvatore was Matteo's cousin, chief advisor, and the man who had managed the Russo estate since the death of Matteo's uncle. He controlled the private mail, the household staff, and nearly every piece of information that entered the mansion. Matteo had trusted him with financial records, security routes, and negotiations that could have destroyed the family if they became public. He had also trusted Salvatore to stand beside Elena's grave. Matteo remembered him placing a hand on his shoulder during the funeral and telling him that grief would pass if he buried himself in work. He remembered Salvatore encouraging him to expand the organization, remove rivals, and stop searching for answers that would never bring Elena back. Now Matteo understood why. Where is he? Matteo asked. At the estate. He believes you are still meeting with the hospital board. Matteo's expression became dangerously calm. Do not contact him. Remove every guard assigned through his office and replace them with men who answer directly to you. His security chief nodded. What about the hospital? Lock down this floor without frightening the staff. No one enters Luca's room unless Elena approves it. Elena stood beside the bed, watching him carefully. You are going after Salvatore. I am going to ask him why he stole 6 years from my son. Men like him do not answer questions. They create another body and call it an answer. Matteo looked at her. Then what do you want me to do? I want you to stop reacting like the man they trained you to be. The accusation struck because it was true. Matteo's first instinct was already building a list of punishments, names, and consequences. He wanted Salvatore dragged from the estate before sunrise. He wanted every man who helped him exposed. He wanted blood to replace the years he could never recover. But Luca was asleep only a few feet away. The boy did not need revenge. He needed surgery. Matteo lowered his voice. Tell me what you need. Elena seemed surprised by the question. Right now? Right now. She looked toward Luca's monitor. He needs the operation scheduled before his condition worsens. He needs doctors who are not connected to your family, and he needs to remain calm. He does not need armed men filling the hallway, or strangers calling him the Russo heir. Matteo nodded slowly. Then none of that will happen. You cannot promise safety when you do not know who inside your organization is loyal to Salvatore. No, but I can promise that I will not move Luca until you believe it is safe. For the first time since Matteo entered the room, some of the tension left Elena's shoulders. It was not trust, but it was a beginning. Matteo opened the old envelope carefully. Inside was a letter written on thin hospital paper. Elena had described the explosion, her pregnancy, and the fear that someone inside the Russo family wanted the child dead. Near the bottom, the handwriting became uneven. I do not know whether you will believe me, but our son deserves a father who knows he exists. His name is Luca Matteo Russo. I gave him your name because I still remember the man you were before your family taught you to become someone else. Matteo stopped reading. The room blurred for a moment. Elena looked away, giving him the privacy she had once offered without being asked. His security chief's phone vibrated. The man checked the screen, and his face tightened. Boss, Salvatore just arrived at the hospital. Matteo folded the letter and placed it inside his jacket. How did he know I was here? Before the security chief could answer, Luca stirred beneath the blankets. His eyes opened slowly, and fear immediately entered his face. Mom, he whispered. The man from the old house is here. Elena moved toward him. What man? Luca looked past Matteo toward the closed door. The one who told me Dad never wanted me. Luca's words changed the air inside the room. Elena moved closer to the bed and took his hand, but the boy kept staring at the closed door as if he expected it to open at any moment. "When did you see him?" she asked. Luca swallowed. "At the old apartment. The night you were working late." Elena's face lost color. Matteo looked at her. "You left him alone?" "With a neighbor I trusted. I was working 2 shifts at the hospital cafeteria." Her voice tightened as she turned back to Luca. "What did the man say to you?" "He said Dad knew where we were. He said Dad had another family and did not want a sick son." Matteo felt the words move through him slowly, each one finding a place where guilt already lived. Luca had not simply grown up without him. Someone had visited the boy and deliberately taught him that his father had rejected him. "Did he touch you?" Matteo asked. Luca shook his head. "He gave me candy. I did not eat it because Mom says not to take things from strangers." Elena closed her eyes briefly, relief and horror crossing her face at the same time. Matteo turned toward his security chief. "Check every camera on this floor. Find Salvatore before he reaches the room." The man stepped into the hallway and began issuing quiet instructions through his phone. Elena looked at Matteo. If Salvatore has been watching us, then he knew about Luca long before tonight. Yes, and he let the illness get worse. Matteo did not answer, because there was nothing he could say that would make the truth less cruel. A soft knock came from the door. Everyone in the room went still. Then Salvatore Russo entered. He wore a dark grey suit and carried no visible weapon. His silver hair was combed neatly, and his expression held the calm concern of a trusted relative arriving during a family emergency. "Matteo," he said. "I came as soon as I heard." Luca pulled the blanket to his chin. Elena immediately noticed. Matteo stepped between Salvatore and the bed. "You should not have known where I was." Salvatore looked toward the security chief standing behind him. "The hospital called the estate. Your name is on the building." No one called the estate. For the first time, Salvatore's expression changed, only slightly. But Matteo saw it. Elena saw it too. Salvatore looked toward her and allowed surprise to appear on his face. "Elena." After all these years, she stood beside Luca and placed one hand on his shoulder. "You knew I was alive." "I suspected. You intercepted my letter." Salvatore exhaled as if the accusation disappointed him. "Your letter arrived during a war. Matteo was surrounded by enemies. I could not allow an unverified message to lead him into a trap." Matteo removed the envelope from inside his jacket and held it up. "You kept it for 6 years. I kept you alive. You kept me away from my son." Salvatore's gaze shifted toward Luca. "A child with a weak heart would have become leverage against you. Your uncle understood that." Matteo's voice became quieter. "And you agreed with him." "I protected the family." Elena laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You visited a child and told him his father did not want him. Was that protection too?" Salvatore looked at Luca. The boy turned his face into Elena's side. That small movement removed every remaining doubt. Matteo stepped closer. "You came to the apartment." Salvatore remained calm. "I wanted to know whether the boy resembled you. You frightened him. I prepared him for reality." Matteo's hands curled at his sides, but he remembered Elena's warning. She had asked him not to react like the man his family had trained him to be. So he did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon. He looked toward his security chief and said, "Remove Salvatore's access to every Russo property, account, vehicle, and communication line. Effective immediately." Salvatore's composure finally cracked. "You cannot remove me because of a woman who lied to you." Matteo looked at Elena, then at Luca. She did not lie. She survived. Salvatore took one step toward the bed. The heart monitor quickened. Matteo moved in front of him. "Do not come closer." Salvatore stopped, but his eyes remained fixed on Luca. Then he said something that made Elena grip the bedrail. "You are all worried about the wrong danger." Luca's surgery is not the reason I came. Matteo's expression hardened. Salvatore looked at the medical chart beside the bed. The surgeon scheduled to operate tomorrow worked for your uncle. Elena stopped breathing. And if you do not listen to me, Salvatore continued, your son may never leave that operating room. For several seconds, no one in the room moved. Elena looked from Salvatore to the medical chart beside Luca's bed, then toward the hallway where the surgical team had passed only minutes earlier. Her hand tightened around the rail until her knuckles turned white. What do you mean he worked for Matteo's uncle? Salvatore's voice remained calm. Dr. Adrian Keller treated several men connected to the Russo organization. Years ago, he performed private procedures for Vittorio and your uncle when they needed injuries, kept out of official records. Matteo watched him carefully. That does not prove he intends to harm Luca. No, but this might. Salvatore reached inside his jacket. Matteo's security chief moved immediately, but Salvatore slowly removed a phone and placed it on the table beside the bed. The screen showed a recent transfer of $200,000 into an offshore account connected to Keller's private foundation. The payment had been made 3 days earlier. Elena stared at the amount. Who sent it? The account belonged to a company your uncle created before his death. Matteo's expression hardened. A dead man did not make that transfer. Exactly. Luca shifted beneath the blankets, and Elena immediately lowered her voice. Can the surgery be delayed? Salvatore looked toward the monitor. Not safely. His condition is worsening. Keller knows that, which is why tomorrow is the perfect opportunity. If Luca dies during a complicated procedure, no one will call it murder. Elena's face changed as fear settled deeper. Matteo stepped toward the chart and picked it up. The surgery had been scheduled for 8 the next morning. Keller's signature appeared at the bottom of every page. He turned to his security chief. Find another surgeon. I already started. No one connected to the Russo family. No one from Boston. Bring in someone Elena chooses. Elena looked at him. There is a specialist in Philadelphia, Dr. Maya Chen. She reviewed Luca's case last year, but I could not afford the full procedure. Call her now. Salvatore gave a quiet laugh. You think changing surgeons solves the problem? Matteo turned toward him. You have said enough. No, I have not. Someone inside your organization still has access to accounts your uncle controlled. Someone knew Elena's letter arrived. Someone knew where she lived. Someone knew which surgeon was assigned to Luca. Matteo's eyes narrowed. You knew all of those things too. Salvatore did not deny it. Elena looked between them, understanding what Matteo had not yet said aloud. You came here to warn us, but you also helped create this. Salvatore's expression tightened. I followed orders when your uncle was alive. After he died, I believed the danger was over. You visited Luca, Elena said. You told him his father did not want him. I thought keeping him afraid of Matteo would stop you from coming back. Matteo's voice became dangerously quiet. You decided my son was safer, believing I hated him. I decided he was safer hidden. Matteo stepped closer, but before he could answer, Luca spoke from the bed. Did you know I was sick? Salvatore looked at him. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes were steady. Yes. Elena turned sharply. How long? Almost 2 years. The confession struck harder than any threat. Matteo felt his anger rise again, but this time he did not look at Salvatore. He looked at Luca, who had just learned that another adult had watched him suffer and chosen silence. Salvatore tried to continue. I monitored the medical records because I needed to know whether Elena would contact you. You could have helped him, Matteo said. If I paid for treatment, the money would have led back to me. You protected yourself. I protected the organization. Matteo's face became still. Then Luca reached toward the faded wedding photograph on his chest. Mom said Dad did not know about me. Elena looked down at him. He did not. Luca turned toward Matteo. Do you know now? Matteo moved closer to the bed and stopped beside Elena. Yes, then do not leave. The request was so simple that it broke through everything else in the room. Matteo sat beside him without asking permission, and Luca slowly placed his small hand inside his. Matteo closed his fingers around it carefully. I am not going anywhere. At that moment, the phone beside Salvatore began to ring. The screen displayed, at that moment, the no number, only the name Dr. Keller. Salvatore looked at Matteo. Matteo answered the call and held the phone to his ear. A man's voice came through the speaker. If you want the boy to survive tomorrow, bring Elena to the old Russo clinic before midnight. Matteo kept the phone against his ear, while every person in the room waited for the voice on the other end to continue. Dr. Keller sounded calm, almost bored, as if he were discussing a routine appointment instead of a child whose life depended on him. You have until midnight, he said. Bring Elena alone. If I see police, hospital security, or any Russo men near the clinic, the arrangement is over. Matteo looked at Elena. She had heard every word. What do you want with her? He asked. That is not your concern. Everything involving my wife and son is my concern. A brief silence followed. Then Keller said, She has something your uncle spent 7 years trying to recover. The call ended. Matteo lowered the phone slowly. Elena looked confused. I do not have anything. Salvatore stepped closer to the table. Think carefully. Did anyone give you documents after the explosion? A key, a drive, a photograph, anything connected to your escape? No. The doctor who helped me disappear gave me money, new identification, and Luca's birth records. That was all. Matteo noticed the hesitation before her final words. What are you not telling me? Elena looked toward Luca. The boy was watching them closely, his hand still resting inside Matteo's. She lowered her voice. The doctor gave me a small metal box. He said I should never open it, unless someone from the Russo family found us. Salvatore's expression changed. Where is it? Elena turned toward him. Why? Because your uncle kept financial ledgers outside the organization. Names, payments, judges, police officers, doctors, and politicians. If that box contains what I think it does, Keller is not trying to protect an old secret. He is trying to erase everyone who can expose it. Matteo looked at Elena. Where did you hide the box? In a storage locker near the apartment we left 6 months ago. Who else knows? No one. Luca shifted against the pillow. I know. Elena turned sharply. What do you mean? The boy looked nervous. I saw you put it inside the blue suitcase. You said we could never lose it. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. She had spent years protecting Luca from the truth, but survival had forced him to notice more than any child should. Matteo squeezed the boy's hand gently. You did nothing wrong. Luca looked at him. Are the bad men looking for it? Yes. Then Mom should not go. Elena brushed the hair away from his forehead. I will be careful. No. Luca's voice became stronger. You always say that before we move again. The words stopped her. Matteo heard the exhaustion behind them. Luca was tired of apartments, false names, and leaving before sunrise. He was tired of watching his mother make brave decisions that frightened both of them. Matteo stood. Elena is not going alone. Keller's warning still hung over the room, but Matteo no longer intended to follow rules written by the men who had already stolen 7 years from his family. Elena faced him. If he sees your men, he may refuse to help Luca. Keller was never planning to help him. The surgery was leverage from the beginning. Then why ask for me? Because he believes you can lead him to the box. Salvatore looked toward the hospital door. The old clinic has 2 entrances. The public entrance is visible from the street, but there is a delivery passage beneath the parking structure. Your uncle used it for private patients. Matteo studied him. You know the building. I worked there for years. Then, you are coming with me. Salvatore shook his head. Keller will recognize the trap. He already expects one. Matteo turned to his security chief. Contact Dr. Chen in Philadelphia. Tell her Luca needs emergency transport and ask what equipment she requires. Do not use any Russo accounts or vehicles. Elena stared at him. You are moving the surgery. I am removing Keller's control over our son. For the first time, Matteo saw something in her expression that resembled trust. It lasted only a moment. Then a nurse entered carrying a sealed medical bag. She stopped when she saw the number of people in the room. This was delivered for Mrs. Russo. Elena took the bag carefully. Inside was the blue metal box from her storage locker. Resting on top of it was a photograph taken less than an hour earlier. It showed Luca asleep in his hospital bed. On the back, someone had written one sentence: "We are already inside." The photograph changed the room more completely than any gunshot could have. It had been taken from inside Luca's hospital room less than an hour earlier. Whoever sent it had stood close enough to see the child's face, the monitor beside his bed, and the faded wedding picture resting against his chest. Elena immediately moved in front of Luca. Matteo turned toward his security chief. No one leaves this floor. Check every nurse, doctor, technician, and visitor who entered after we arrived. The man reached for his phone, but Matteo stopped him. Do it quietly. If the person watching Luca realizes we know, they may act before we find them. Salvatore stared at the blue metal box inside the medical bag. They already searched Elena's storage locker. That means Keller has people in both places. Elena looked at him. Then, how did they know which hospital room was his? Salvatore did not answer quickly enough. Matteo noticed. You gave someone access. I gave Keller access to Luca's medical records 2 years ago. Elena's face tightened. You said you were only monitoring him. I needed someone to tell me how serious the condition was. And you chose a doctor who worked for the men hunting us. Salvatore looked ashamed, but shame was no longer enough. Matteo stepped closer. From this moment, you do not make another decision involving my family. Salvatore accepted the order without defending himself. A soft sound came from the hallway. A cartwheel squeaked once, then stopped outside the room. Everyone turned toward the door. The handle moved slowly. Matteo placed one hand inside his jacket, while his security chief moved to the wall beside the entrance. Elena sat beside Luca and pulled the blanket higher around him, trying to keep his attention away from the fear spreading across the room. The door opened. A hospital orderly entered with a tray of medication. He was young, nervous, and wearing an identification badge that did not match his face. Matteo saw it immediately. The orderly looked toward the blue box. Then he reached beneath the tray. Matteo crossed the room before the man could pull anything free. He caught the orderly's wrist, forced his arm against the wall, and sent the tray crashing to the floor. The security chief searched him and removed a syringe from inside his sleeve. Elena went pale. What was in that? The man remained silent. Matteo's security chief examined the label. A sedative. Enough to stop Luca's breathing, if it entered his line. Elena covered Luca's ears, but the boy had already heard. His eyes filled with fear. Mom, are they trying to kill me? Elena tried to answer, but her voice failed. Matteo released the orderly into his security chief's custody and went to the bed. He sat beside Luca without touching him, until the boy looked directly at him. Listen to me. No one is going to reach you again. Luca glanced toward the door. You said you would not leave. I meant it. What about the bad doctor? Matteo looked at Elena before answering. He will never operate on you. The boy's breathing began to slow. Elena watched Matteo remain beside him, calm and present, rather than chasing the attacker into the hallway. It was the first time she saw him choose his son over revenge without hesitation. The security chief returned, after handing the orderly to 2 trusted men. He gave us one name before he stopped talking. Matteo looked up. Dr. Keller? The man shook his head. Rebecca Lane. She is the nurse assigned to Luca's overnight care. Elena's face changed. Rebecca was the nurse who had comforted Luca through every test, brought him extra blankets, and helped Elena complete the surgery forms. At that moment, the heart monitor beside the bed went dark. Then every light on the floor shut off. A woman's voice came through the hospital speaker. "Bring the blue box to the surgical wing, Elena. Come alone, or the backup power to Luca's room will not return." The room went dark so suddenly that Luca gasped and reached for Elena. Matteo found the boy's hand in the darkness before panic could take control. The monitors had lost power, but a small internal battery kept one warning light flashing beside the bed. Each pulse of red light revealed Elena standing over her son, the blue metal box held tightly against her chest. A few seconds later, the emergency speaker came alive again. "Bring the box to operating room 6. You have 5 minutes." The voice belonged to Rebecca Lane. Elena looked toward the door. "She controls the backup system." Matteo remained beside Luca. "Then she expects you to leave him unprotected. If I do not go, the equipment may fail." "It will not." He turned toward his security chief. "There is an independent generator beneath this wing. Find the manual switch and restore power without using the hospital network." The man disappeared into the hallway with 2 trusted guards. Salvatore moved toward the blue box. "Rebecca does not want the records. She wants whatever is inside them destroyed before Keller loses control of the surgery." Elena looked at Matteo. "Then we give her the box." "No. We give her a reason to believe you are carrying it." Matteo opened the medical bag and removed the metal container. It was heavier than it appeared. When he lifted the lid, they found several paper ledgers, a small drive, and a collection of sealed photographs. Elena stared at the contents. "All of this was hidden in my storage locker? Your uncle must have believed you would eventually lead someone to it," Salvatore said. Matteo removed the drive and slid it into his pocket. Then he filled the box with folded hospital towels and closed the lid. Elena watched him. "You still expect me to walk into that wing? I expect Rebecca to see what she wants to see." Luca tightened his grip on Matteo's hand. "Do not let Mom go alone." Matteo looked at the boy. "I will be close enough to hear her breathe." Elena took the box, but before she left, she bent over Luca and touched her forehead to his. "I will be back before you count to 100. Luca tried to appear brave. "I can count slowly." Elena smiled, despite the fear in her eyes. Matteo stood and moved beside her. "Salvatore stays here with Luca." Salvatore looked surprised. "You trust me?" "No. I trust that you know what happens if anything reaches him." They entered the dark hallway together. The emergency lights cast long red shadows across the floor, and the usually busy hospital had become unnaturally silent. Doors stood open, abandoned carts blocked the corridor, and somewhere beyond the surgical wing, a machine alarm continued to sound without anyone answering it. Elena walked in front, carrying the box where the security cameras could see it. Matteo followed through an adjoining service corridor, separated from her by one wall and a series of observation windows. When Elena reached operating room 6, the door opened automatically. Rebecca stood inside wearing surgical scrubs, her face calm despite the chaos around her. Dr. Keller waited beside the operating table. Elena entered alone. Rebecca looked at the box. "Place it on the table. Restore the power first." Keller stepped forward. "You are in no position to negotiate." Elena held the box tighter. "Neither are you. If Luca dies, Roman will tear apart every person connected to this." Keller smiled. "Matteo has already spent years mourning one person he failed to protect. He will survive another." The cruelty in his voice made Elena's expression harden. She placed the box on the table. Rebecca opened it. Her face changed when she saw the towels. At the same moment, the lights throughout the hospital returned. Matteo entered through the side door with his weapon lowered but ready. Keller moved toward Elena and grabbed her arm. Matteo stopped. Rebecca reached for a syringe on the tray. Elena reacted before either of them expected it. She drove the metal box into Keller's chest, broke free, and moved behind the operating table. Matteo crossed the room as Rebecca dropped the syringe and tried to escape through the second door. His security chief appeared on the other side and blocked her path. Within seconds, Both Keller and Rebecca were restrained. Elena stood near the wall, breathing hard but unharmed. Matteo went to her first. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Luke?" They ran back toward the room together. When they entered, the monitors were steady again, but Salvatore was standing beside the bed with his phone in his hand and fear on his face. Dr. Chen reviewed the latest scans. He said, "Luca cannot wait until morning." Elena stopped beside the bed. Salvatore continued, "The surgery has to begin within the hour." The words reached Elena before she was ready to understand them. Luca could not wait until morning. For a moment, she stood beside the bed without moving, one hand resting against the rail, while the other covered her mouth. The danger from Keller and Rebecca had ended, but the threat inside her son's chest had not. It had been waiting beneath every argument, every hidden letter, and every year she spent running. Matteo moved beside her. "What does Dr. Chen need?" His security chief checked the message on his phone. "She is still 40 minutes away. She wants the operating room prepared now, and a cardiac team assembled under her instructions." Elena looked toward the hallway. "Keller chose most of the staff. Then we replace anyone connected to him," Matteo said. "Dr. Chen decides who stays." The next hour moved faster than fear could follow. Trusted hospital administrators were brought to the floor. Luca's records were copied before anyone could alter them, and every member of Keller's team was removed from the surgical wing. Dr. Chen arrived from Philadelphia in a private medical transport and went directly to Luca's room without stopping to speak to the board. She examined him, reviewed the scans, and then looked at Elena and Matteo. "The surgery is difficult, but it is possible. Waiting would be more dangerous than proceeding tonight." Elena sat beside Luca and held both of his hands. The boy looked from her to Matteo. "Will it hurt?" Dr. Chen answered gently. "You will be asleep, and when you wake up, your heart should work much better." Luca tried to smile, but fear remained in his eyes. Matteo sat on the other side of the bed. He did not promise that nothing could go wrong. He had spent too much of his life hearing men make promises they could not control. Instead, he said, "Your mother and I will be here when you wake up." Luca looked at him carefully. "Both of you? Both of us." The nurse arrived to take Luca towards surgery. Elena walked beside the bed until the doors of the operating wing forced her to stop. She kissed her son's forehead, whispered that she loved him, and watched until the bed disappeared from view. Only then did her strength collapse. Matteo caught her before she reached the floor. She pressed both hands against his chest and cried with the exhaustion of every night she had spent alone beside Luca's hospital bed. Matteo held her without speaking, because no apology could carry the weight of what she had endured. "I was so afraid you would find us," she whispered. "Now I am afraid we found you too late." Matteo closed his eyes. "He is going to know that I came," he said. "Whatever happens, he will know I did not leave." Elena pulled back and looked at him through her tears. "You cannot disappear after tonight. He will not survive losing you after finally finding you. I know." "No, Matteo. I need you to understand. Being his father is not one dramatic rescue. It is every ordinary day after this." He held her gaze. "Then I will be there for every one of them." The surgery lasted 5 hours. Matteo sat beside Elena the entire time. He did not answer calls from the organization, ask for updates before the doctors were ready, or leave to confront Salvatore. For the first time in his adult life, the Russo empire waited while he remained exactly where his family needed him. Shortly before sunrise, Dr. Chen entered the waiting room. Elena stood so quickly that the chair fell behind her. The surgeon removed her mask. The repair was successful. Elena covered her face and began to cry. Matteo lowered his head as relief moved through him with enough force to make his knees weak. Dr. Chen continued, "The next 24 hours are important, but he came through the operation well. You can see him when he reaches recovery." Elena turned toward Matteo. He expected distance, caution, or another reminder that one good night could not erase 7 lost years. Instead, she stepped into his arms. Matteo held her while the morning light, entered through the hospital windows. For the first time since hearing her lullaby in the hallway, he allowed himself to believe that the woman he had buried and the son he never knew might both remain in his life. Then his security chief approached with Salvatore, walking beside him. Salvatore looked at Elena before facing Matteo. "There is one more thing you need to know," he said. "Keller was not acting for your dead uncle." Matteo's expression hardened. Salvatore lowered his voice. "The person financing him is still inside the Russo family." Matteo looked at Salvatore and waited. Salvatore placed a folder on the table. Inside were bank transfers, private messages, and recordings connecting Dr. Keller to Bianca Russo, Matteo's mother. She had financed the operation from inside the family accounts, convinced that a sick child would weaken Matteo and threaten the future of the organization. She had also approved the order to intercept Elena's letter 6 years earlier. Matteo read the evidence without speaking. For most of his life, Bianca had taught him that family blood came before everything. Now he understood that she had never protected the Russo family. She had protected her control over it. He closed the folder and looked at his security chief. "Remove her access to every Russo property, account, and command. Send copies of this evidence to the authorities and the hospital board. She does not come near Elena or Luca again." Salvatore stared at him. "If you expose her, the family council may turn against you." Matteo looked through the recovery room window, where Elena sat beside Luca's bed and held his hand while he slept. "Then they can choose another boss." The answer surprised everyone except Elena. She had heard him through the open door. 1 year later, Luca stood beneath the bronze sign of the Elena Russo Pediatric Center, healthy enough to run through the hospital garden without stopping to catch his breath. Matteo attended every appointment, every school meeting, and every ordinary evening when Luca wanted someone to help with homework or listen to stories about his day. Elena did not return to the Russo mansion. She chose a quiet house outside Boston, and Matteo never pressured her to leave it. He understood that saving Luca once did not erase the years she had carried him alone. One evening, Matteo arrived to find Elena sitting beside Luca's bed, singing the same lullaby that had led him back to them. When the song ended, she looked at him and held out her hand. Matteo took it carefully. "I cannot give you back the years you lost," he said. "No," Elena replied, "but you can stop wasting the ones we still have." Luca opened his eyes and smiled at them both. Matteo had spent his life commanding men through fear, yet the family he wanted most could not be ordered to love him. It could only choose him, and day by day, that was exactly what they began to do. Do you believe Matteo deserved another chance? Or was Elena too forgiving after everything she endured? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe for more emotional Mafia romance stories about betrayal, sacrifice, family,